Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Inaya Folarin Iman. She's a journalist and a broadcaster and the director and founder of the Equiano project, a discussion forum focused on race, culture and politics. We had an argument about free speech and liberalism. We talked about the enormous diversity of views among British ethnic minorities and why it's a mistake to import American ideas about race to the UK. And we spoke about British Nigerian attitudes towards sex and dating and how they are crucially distinct from the sort of sex-positive narratives that we're most familiar with. As always, you can find Maiden, Mother, Matriarch on Substack at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find extended episodes, bonus episodes, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. All right, Inaya, you founded the Equiano project.
Yes.
How long ago now? How long's it been running?
Since 2020. So at the height of all of the Black Lives Matter protests.
A crucial year, yeah. And what was the reasoning behind the name?
So the name is named after a 17th century former slave and abolitionist called Olaudah Equiano. And he was of British and Nigerian heritage. And it was named after him because I think twofold. One, a lot of the time when we're talking about issues related to kind of race and identity and anti-racism, we focus almost exclusively on what are the hugely influential and important figures in American history that have shaped, you know, the modern world, such as kind of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so on. But there are also really fascinating and important Black British figures during hundreds of years ago that actually really shaped the legacy of where we are today when it comes to those issues. But on top of that, his story is actually particularly interesting. It's really fascinating that he bought his own freedom through his kind of extraordinary entrepreneurship. And he really was a demonstration that even in times of just unbelievable suffering and subjugation, that there have been human beings that have been able to kind of rise above their circumstances and embody agency and kind of human imagination and transformation. So I thought that his story, in the context of, I think, oftentimes the direction of travel when it comes to anti-racism, is one of victimhood, one of inherited racial burden and oppression, that actually, if somebody even hundreds of years ago, which was a time much more difficult to say the least for Black and ethnic minority people, rejected that kind of sense of self and used that, his own agency, to change his circumstances, then how can we talk in such self-detrimental terms? So that was the reason it was named after him. And I thought that he was a great example of the kinds of values and principles that underpin the project, which is much more universalistic, much more about how individuals and communities can kind of take responsibility to change their circumstances and open to lots of different perspectives and negotiating and discussing in an open way. So that was the reason why the project's named after him.
Awesome, and that is the goal of the organisation, right? To be offering a counter narrative to the very Americanized. Now, I love the fact that you're being sort of explicitly non-American in how you're going about this, including in the name that you've chosen.
Yeah, so that the goal is to essentially show that ethnic minority people, as it sounds so obvious, but frustratingly in the kind of contemporary conversation, it doesn't feel that way. It sounds obvious to say that ethnic minority people have a wide range of perspectives. You know, not all people think that Britain is institutionally racist. And there's kind of like several kind of core tenets of the discussion. One is that racism is embedded within society and it never really ends, it just kind of transforms, or it never really gets better. So it's one about recognizing progress and the like ways that things have changed, but also, you know, this idea that anytime there's a kind of disparity in socioeconomic outcomes, that must be because there's some kind of underlying discrimination or prejudice involved. And that's not to say that sometimes that isn't the case, but there are also other reasons, such as, you know, cultural factors, economic factors, family, individual behaviour. There's all sorts of reasons. So how do we kind of understand it to a deeper degree rather than embrace this kind of one size fits all? So it's about recognising the change that's happened, opening up the conversation and giving a greater platform to the lots of interesting and challenging conservative, Marxist, post-liberal voices that are ethnic minority that kind of get marginalised in this conversation that everything is racist and that's all we should talk about and that's all we should care about.
Yeah, one of the interesting paradoxes about the sort of progressive narrative on race is that on the one hand, progressives typically style themselves as the great sort of champions of ethnic minorities, but on the other hand, there really isn't that fine-grained understanding of, one, the fact that just not being white doesn't mean that you share literally any opinions or interests whatsoever, and two, the fact that actually a lot of ethnic minority groups in Britain and in elsewhere are really not very progressive actually on a lot of issues, and actually are much more likely to be socially conservative and much more religious, and, you know, all of these things that actually completely run contrary to the sort of standard narrative.
It's so interesting. I mean, seeing just the discussion, for example, about Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, you know, people making these egregious comparisons with her views on immigration. You know, loads of people in my family completely share the views that she has. But just because that you may be a child of, or even came from a different country, doesn't mean that you don't recognise that, for example, in a coherent nation state, that you need to regulate your borders, and that actually people coming here in small boats is not ideal for national security and social integration and you know, criminality. You know, this idea that because you're an ethnic minority person, that you must effectively believe in open borders and have a closer affinity to people that are coming over versus the country that you've chosen to live in and the country that you're proud of and often, you know, born into, it just shows that just complete disconnect from actually the views that many ethnic minority people think. And as you said, you know, faith. Now, I'm not a religious person myself, but the 95% of my family are either Christian or Muslim. And that is the truth for most ethnic minority people. I mean, my ethnic background is Nigerian, and it really is now the kind of evangelical Pentecostal Christians of West Africa that are kind of keeping Christianity alive, and that the traditional views associated around marriage and kind of sexual minorities is often at odds with progressive attitudes, and that nuance and that appreciation is just totally kind of sidelined. And it is very interesting. Many of the kind of voices that are held up in the public conversation as the champions of ethnic minority, even the ones that are ethnic minority themselves, they often don't come from a background that is similar to the views of most people. I mean, another example is policing. It's a great, that when people think about policing and ethnic minority people, the overwhelming discussion is police, stop and search, and police being institutionally racist. Actually, consistently polling has showed that actually ethnic minority people are more in favour of tougher policing than the population at large. Even something like cannabis use, which we often hear is one of the ways that the police are targeting young black men. Actually, if you look at the views of ethnic minority families, they are almost double when it comes to wanting the police to crack down on even minor cannabis use. And so the conversation is just very at odds. And to me, whether you are a liberal ethnic minority or a conservative ethnic minority, you know, they all should have a voice when it comes to policies and conversations that are shaping their lives and being spoken for them.
Yeah, this is so telling when you look at you actually look at survey data on attitudes towards policing, as you say. The demographic, if I'm remembering rightly, who are most pro-police in general are middle-aged South Asian women. Middle-aged South Asian women love the police, right? Like more than any other group, which really doesn't at all fit with the sort of standard narrative. But then the standard narrative does depend on a lot of well, I mean, I think what's going on actually is what psychologists call outgroup homogeneity bias. This sort of deep-seated instinct within humans to assume that people in the outgroup are more similar to each other than they actually are. And I think that a lot of sort of white progressives don't actually mix very much with people from outside of their group, even if they live in London or whatever. They don't actually have that many friends who are outside of kind of white elite circles. And I think they do just assume that people are much more of one mind than they are, whereas that's not true at all. And actually, there's a lot of conflict as well between different ethnic minorities, which I don't think progressives are even aware of.
Yeah, no, it is so true. But the thing is, when it comes to ethnic minority people, it seems to go further than other types of bias. So it is when there are people that question certain narratives or present a different view, then they are subject to kind of huge scrutiny, or their kind of authenticity as an ethnic minority person is kind of delegitimized and questioned. So in terms of just that bias, it often feels that it's kind of perceived of as a threat, because there's so many kind of interest groups and ideologies that are kind of wedded to a view of ethnic minority people that they are victims. Because actually, if you start to kind of question things, and racism, of course, is still a problem. And I think it is frustrating that one has to caveat that, like, that if you even, question that it's the biggest problem, facing ethnic minority people, then somehow you must think that racism doesn't exist. That's obviously not the case. But this sense that if you start to accept, maybe there are different views, that there's a lot of other things that kind of seem to break down. Well, maybe Britain isn't this horrible kind of racist hellhole. And maybe the past is actually much more complicated than what we're painting it out to be. And that, it's full of horrendous subjugation, but also, human bravery and triumph. And that human complexity is actually a much more interesting way of understanding ourselves than this, one blanket narrative. So the frustrating thing that I find when it comes to the rigid nature of the debate on race is that there's lots of different things that seem to be wedded to a view that ethnic minority people are victims.
Would you describe yourself as a conservative? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this for like years, because I mean, anyone that will say these things are just going to be assumed to be a conservative. I mean, it's a cliche, but I don't think that a lot of the ways in which we think about politics in this left and right way is particularly useful to understanding the way that people think today. So, I mean, for example, what was very interesting about the kind of populist movements is that many of them were obviously widely regarded as on the right, but actually economically they were talking about concerns about the level of inequality in society, and that the kind of so-called deplorables and downtrodden were not getting their kind of fair share and were being marginalised by the elite, and that wanting to reinstill manufacturing and jobs. So in that sense, it was hard to place them politically just so neatly. And actually, interestingly, many kind of Bernie Sanders supporters eventually supported Trump. So in that sense, I sometimes find it difficult. Now, that particular political outlook doesn't necessarily reflect my own, but I think it's a similar parallel where I think because things have got so too far the other direction, that critiquing that can just seem like you're a conservative as such, when actually I would consider myself a kind of soft liberal. Don't think that liberalism should...
I'd consider you that way as well, to be honest.
I don't think liberalism should be taken to its ultimate conclusion. But I wouldn't, I'm a soft liberal, I would say.
Yeah, because we often, I mean, gosh, I have seen myself described in print as both right wing and left wing, with people with absolute confidence describing me in both, using both terms. I sort of avoid using any, as I think you do, because it is sort of certainly getting pegged as conservative has its downsides, and that you end up being siloed, I think, and you can't, speak to particular audiences and so on. But both of us, I think, do sometimes end up under that heading of, conservative young women. But we actually disagree about heaps.
No, we do.
I know, having talked about it recently. I think you are much more sincerely a liberal, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. I think my views on freedom of speech, I've campaigned on freedom of speech very strongly. I do... my views on race, I would say, are actually liberal views. It is about kind of an emphasis on a universalistic kind of outlook, and that is very much about progress. And also even kind of sex and dating. I very much agree with the critiques about the society's turn to where there's kind of no boundaries anymore, and there's nothing to kind of rail against. But I'm also very sympathetic to a kind of permissive society, and I kind of like the idea of living in a society that where people feel that they can experiment very widely and not have too much kind of moral and social judgment alongside that. So I would say a soft liberal would describe me more than anything else.
The comparison with free speech and sort of sexual freedom is a really interesting one, because I think yes, you're consistent on it. I think that you just want to give individuals as much scope as possible to make their own decisions, and I think a lot of people would say they feel the same way. Sometimes revealed preferences show that they don't actually feel that way, but it's a common sentiment to hear from anyone with any kind of liberal sympathies, and I don't completely disagree. I think, though, that I suppose I understand that kind of social freedom on a spectrum, and I think in reality it's quite hard to actually permit people that degree of freedom, which is not to say that it's kind of Saudi Arabia or nothing. I really don't think that. I mean, so on free speech, we can start with talking about free speech, because I think it does link really closely to the sexual politics. My view on free speech is I think it should be protected in law. I think basically the status quo in Britain in law is fine. This kind of creeping censoriousness on university campuses, which you've obviously spoken about a lot, and in the media and so on, I find to be really sinister. I also think that what the reason... I don't know if you've ever read this Ed West essay from some years ago. I'll link to it in the bio because I can't remember the exact title, but the theory he puts forward is that the reason that we're now having conflicts over free speech and a degree of censoriousness on campus and so on that we weren't experiencing, say, 20 years ago, is not necessarily because people have sort of abandoned the abstract principles of free speech and liberalism in general. It's because we're seeing a sort of ideological changing of the guard. So the example he uses is Monty Python's Life of Brian, which was made in the 1970s and was the target of lots of anti-blasphemy Christian opprobrium. And there were real efforts to get it shut down, which didn't succeed in the end, because obviously the film is very blasphemous in a whole bunch of ways and really makes fun of Christianity, right? But it got away with it because it was at that point in the 70s where actually that old guard were no longer really powerful enough to shut down a film, right? But it also couldn't be made now because of the Loretta scene, because of the scene where They basically make fun of trans people. So you could get away with that in the 70s, but you couldn't get away with that now. So it was kind of in a sweet spot where the old guard weren't strong enough to shut it down, but the new guard hadn't yet attained the strength that they have now. And so basically the reason that it felt as though there was an unusual degree of freedom of speech was actually because there wasn't like a single ideology in charge. And it meant that like neither side was really powerful enough to have their way. And the reason that we're now seeing a shift towards more censoriousness is because actually there is a new dominant ideology which is very powerful and is able to shut down. I mean, basically the cynical view is that when people can shut down their enemies' speech, they will try to. And you can have laws in the way of that, which I think is a good thing, but it kind of ends up being a power game, whether or not you want it to be, because that's just the nature of human beings.
Yeah, no, I find that I did read that essay. I think there's a lot of truth in that, and in a sense, that's kind of why the government, even when they've tried to literally pass a law to protect freedom of speech on campus, and it's kind of ratcheting up, where they feel the need to actually pass a law, that still hasn't really made the kinds of impacts, because ultimately this ideology, this kind of zeitgeist is pervasive and dominant within institutions, and it is this kind of new moral framework. I think that I think, well, I was rereading Christopher Lash, Revolt of the Elites, which was written in the mid-90s. And what was really strange about it was just that it could have been written today. So he talks about this elite that are kind of highly mobile, kind of disconnected from kind of place and community, that they're kind of like global citizens and don't really believe in the nation state. And that they are increasingly kind of contemptuous and resentful of the past, and kind of derive kind of moral authority from rejecting the past, and often seeing it as a place of kind of all the horrors of racism and sexism and misogyny, and all of those things. And it was just very striking that this is clearly something that has been developing over the last kind of 30 or 40 years. And even though the conversation has really reached a kind of mainstream discussion with lots of people talking about it, it has been a kind of growing problem that about the institutions increasingly embracing a kind of new ideology. And I do think personally that it is related to the rise of a kind of therapeutic culture, which no longer sees individuals. And this is perhaps where you and I might disagree, because I think this is a kind of rejection of a kind of Enlightenment liberal notion of human beings kind of taking control of their circumstances and history and shaping it. And this increasing embrace of a view of human beings as vulnerable, as fundamentally vulnerable. And when you kind of mix that with the politics of identity, you get this fixation on perceived vulnerable groups that cannot handle free speech, that the overriding kind of concern should be about the protection from harm of these groups. And so this is, as kind of universities and other institutions have kind of lost confidence and faith in some of those liberal ideals and those kind of principles that would give them confidence and authority, they've kind of grabbed onto these other ideals within society, these other kind of emergent religions and other emergent moral values. And the dominant one at the time, and which has been growing and seemingly will continue for a while, is one about protecting from harm and self-flagellating about the past. And so within that context, freedom of speech it takes a backseat to the protection of vulnerable minorities, the apologising for apparent mistakes that most people, if not everybody today, had nothing to do with. And this gives a new kind of moral authority, a new kind of reason to exist, to kind of champion a new cause, and everything else takes a back seat. So I think that kind of thesis that you proposed from Ed West is right insofar as during the kind of mid-20th century, it was a kind of middle period, an interregnum between the complete kind of rejection of the old values, but and this kind of emergent new one, so that there was perhaps a space where lots of things are up for grabs, but now this new ideology has been institutionalized. But I would argue that the part of the problem is estrangement from liberal ideals, and so I think there should always be a relationship between a dynamic between the conservatives and the liberals that kind of talk about freedom, and the conservatives that are worried that we're in our kind of pursuit of greater freedom, that we lose the things that rightly constrain our freedom, such as, you know, obligation, responsibility, duty, and tradition. So I think it's both the liberals and the conservatives that have lost the kind of meaning of their purpose. Yeah.
Maiden Mother Matriarch is brought to you by Keeper, the world's most advanced matchmaking solution. Now, many of you will know that I'm normally extremely suspicious of dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, which tend to produce repeat customers who must endure endless, miserable hookups and short-term relationships without ever finding a spouse. Well, Keeper is a completely different kind of service. Its algorithm prioritizes immediate attraction, but also, crucially, long-term compatibility, because forever is the goal. Everyone in the Keeper matchmaking pool is there because they want to find a spouse. Using psychometric tests like Big Five, IQ, and masculine-feminine polarity, Keeper can accurately predict who you're going to have the strongest chemistry with. The platform only gives you a match if you are an exact fit psychometrically, and if the match offers everything that you've told Keeper you're looking for in a partner. It won't waste your time with only good enough matches like other dating apps and matchmaking services will. So, find your Keeper at keeper.ai. That's KEEPER.ai. I mean, it is certainly true now that liberal is such a confusing term. I hate
that is true.
It is. I think it's better. Yes, I think it's better to talk about progressives if we're talking, or like woke. I mean, wokeness is also a horrible term. I think progressives is a useful term to describe this ideology, which is all about, yes, rejecting the past, all this stuff. It's certainly true that they actually don't necessarily care that much about free speech, and you can ask in, you know, they will people will still often pay lip service to free speech, but actually, even so, you can ask in polling, you know, do you think, for instance, that free speech is more important than protecting vulnerable people from offence? And plenty of people will say no, protecting vulnerable people from offence is more important. There's a big sex skew as well, which I'm sure you're aware of, that women are much less interested in protecting free speech when it comes up against protecting people from offence. Which is kind of disturbing. And actually there is I often think that particularly online, the sort of progressive discourse is very feminine. I went to a girls' school. I know what girls' school culture is like, and it feels a lot like girls' school culture. You know, it's simultaneously very... it's all about displaying oneself as being really nice and really inclusive and caring about vulnerable people and being really nurturing, but actually it can be really savage. And there's a degree of aggression that's just sort of just beneath the surface, which involves social ostracism and shutting down conversation and all this kind of stuff. Is very, very marked in our new culture, I suppose. So, I mean, I do think that free speech is important. I do. I also think, though, this might sound a bit provocative, I think that people tend to complain about free speech when they're losing. I think it's the thing you resort to when actually you're on the back foot. Your political group is on the back foot, and you might not be able to advance your actual opinions and actually make changes and actually capture institutions, but you can. The only thing you've kind of got in your arsenal is to say, please let us speak.
But
please at least let us speak.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but in a way, I don't necessarily think that's a challenge or a bad thing, because, I would argue that free speech, that's one of the great things about free speech, that it's almost the last resort of those that are genuinely kind of don't have kind of economic or political power. And that was what was so amazing about it in the kind of mid 20th century, with the civil rights movements that didn't have as I said, economic power or were not kind of fairly represented in the kind of political mainstream, that they could articulate and argue for, even in a context that was very hostile to them and saw them as kind of immoral or arguing things that undermined the kind of social fabric, that it was their free speech that was so powerful. So in a sense, even if it is a kind of cope, or even if it is this kind of last tool when someone's not really winning the political fight, I think that shows why it's so important that it is still it should still be protected and should still be regarded so highly, because it is a tool that, regardless of whether you're up or down, we can still call upon to use to convince other people. But the thing is, what's even though, I mean, I don't really talk too much about kind of campus issues anymore. I mean, obviously, there comes a point where you get a bit too far away from the university campus to kind of still start kind of campaigning on it. And there are some people.
You feel really ancient showing up there, yeah.
So it's not something that I kind of talk about as much. But I do think that, not completely, but slightly, my views on it have changed. I don't think I've said this publicly yet, but I do think it is fair to say that, what are you doing with your free speech? Not the way that I think a lot of the kind of radical progressive activists use it, but I think there is something legitimate in saying, actually, we live in a context where kind of truth is increasingly relativized, that like transcendent or high moral values such as kind of goodness and beauty are treated with hostility or relativized as well. Is it so wrong to ask you, how are you using your free speech to say something beautiful, meaningful, interesting and inspiring? And this, I think, increasingly very shallow form of free speech advocacy, which is just often, I can say whatever I want. And I think that kind of confuses freedom with license. And actually, it is
being a bit of a troll.
Exactly. And, there's always a space for those kinds of people. But I would like the free speech conversation to move beyond just, I'm being cancelled, to, how do we, revivify and re-enlighten our civic life, where the speech that rises to the top and gets the most attention are the ones that are saying things and doing things that are really inspiring and taking society forward. So I kind of accept a level of that, which is slightly different to what I probably would have said a couple of years ago. But I do think there's the challenges and questions that we're facing as a society, kind of morally and economically, require us to actually not just say, it's my free speech, but also, where's your free speech going towards kind of actually strengthening our kind of moral and social fabric?
Yeah, there's a role for the trolls. There is a role for the trolls. But the problem is, I guess, when you're, this is sort of evident in the fact that both of us are a little bit reluctant to be described as conservative. when it's low status to be conservative, basically, right? When progressives are absolutely on the ascendant and they have captured all sorts of important institutions, not all institutions, but definitely universities, definitely much of the media, NGOs, a lot of politics, and so on. When you are on the back foot in terms of your political group, sort of by definition, the people who are going to be most eager to pipe up are the ones who are least sensitive to social rejection, right? So actually it's kind of a field day for trolls because they enjoy being provocative, they enjoy upsetting people, and that's fine. Like that, there is a role for that, but it does kind of coarsen the discourse when you don't have much more moderate, agreeable, basically, voices willing to pipe up because they just don't want to face. They just can't be dealing with all the social consequences of it, which is fair. Like, it does suck I'm in an unusually strong position in that I basically am an independent. My income is independent of all of this stuff. I can't be fired really by anyone. I'm not vulnerable to any kind of the disciplinary processes within institutions. But if you are an academic or you work for certain media outlets, you really struggle. I guess you have the same joyful freedom in working for GB News, where you're not going to get fired for being anti-woke, right? The opposite, which is amazing. But most people aren't in that position. And so I suppose the point where it will be clear that actually the pushback against wokeness is actually achieving something is when you're not just hearing from the trolls who are happy to get in trouble. You're hearing from the people who are more moderate and more frightened of the social consequences. That's when you actually are clearly gaining ground.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think actually what I do worry about is increasing kind of silos where people are just in these kind of groups of echo chambers that are not really talking to one another. And I do think it is, a tragedy that the mainstream institutions, whether that's kind of broadcasting, universities, but also kind of museums and galleries, have effectively become captured by this ideology uncritically. And it's not creative, it's predictable, it's not interesting. And I think that that's kind of reflected in the fact that all of these kind of skirmishes that happened around, the BBC or whatever that is, that actually it is completely at odds with the way the majority of people think. So I do think it is sad if we all go into kind of silos. And therefore the goal really should still be convincing people within mainstream institutions to remember their fundamental moral purpose, whether that's being the kind of custodians of our historical legacy and artifacts, to making sure that you're creating programs that treat different perspectives as if they're kind of fair and legitimate. Anytime there's a program on race, for example, there will be one view, and you might get like myself or somebody else that is a token alternative perspective that will have a line for 30 seconds in an hour-long program. And you see that with the debate about gender as well. Oftentimes the debate about gender, there'll be kind of like spooky music alongside the gender critical voice, just so people know.
Yes. An unflattering lighting. Yeah.
And the Equiano project, we put on a conference at Cambridge in January of this year. It was called Towards the Common Good, Rethinking Race in the 21st Century. And we brought together, so even though I've been talking about the importance of remembering the kind of British context, there are kind of important transatlantic similarities within the racial discussion as well. So many of the key thinkers on the critical of identity politics perspective, we brought them over, such as Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. And over 2 days, we had a discussion over just what on earth is going on. You know, why has the conversation turned this way, and how can we kind of organise collectively in order to kind of shift the narrative. And it is, you know, it is just amazing to hear that in America it is far more extreme, far more polarised, far more divided. But there are also similarities, you know, and for example, the kind of cherry picking of statistics to suit a kind of particular narrative, the demonisation of ethnic minority people that disagree, the attempt to essentialise the past as this kind of singular evil thing that kind of bulldozes over any of the historical complexities, and the refusal to recognise progress. So in that sense, you know, whilst I do think that we should emphasise how we're different and recognise the kind of British context, I do think that there is also a lot of scope for cross-Atlantic discussions and cross-Atlantic collaborations on all of these issues, because the challenges we're facing, you know, in Western democracies around the kind of rise of politics of identity and you know, elite disconnection is actually quite similar.
I get the impression, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I've not actually seen like numbers, there aren't nearly as many women who are putting forward the sort of anti-woke position on race. Not that there are a few that I can think of off the top of my head, but in terms of the numbers, it's definitely quite a small minority. I wonder if that comes down to this, what we were just talking about before, the social consequences of being heterodox. I wonder if, in general, women are not as willing to be hated as are men.
It is quite interesting because I don't know if you know Thomas Chatterton Williams. He's a right.
I love his books. Really good writer.
Yeah, he writes for the Atlantic, and he was saying to me a few weeks ago that in America there's like one or two heterodox ethnic minority women on race, but there's quite a few in Britain. So there's myself. I don't know if you come across Aisha Akambi. There's
Yes, I've seen her interview.
Yeah, Mercy Moroki, Manira. So there's a few. I think that there might be a few more than there are males. Ethnic minority in the UK.
Yeah, maybe that's
So I'm not. My theory. I've not assessed it. System. This is not a scientific research or anything, but my theory is because a lot of us come from West African backgrounds. So obviously in America, it's quite different in terms of the history of the way that kind of Black women were viewed and treated. Whereas in the UK, I think that kind of West African, or actually just African in general, because there's a few that are kind of East African as well, that it is very kind of strong on that rejection of victimhood. I mean, my background, Nigerian, and the way that my family respond to this issue, they've got way too much pride to allow society to kind of view them in a particular way. And there is this kind of strong ethos of personal responsibility, education and building wealth within the Nigerian cultural community. That I think that has quite a strong influence on a lot of the young people that are critiquing. So for example, to me, were Aisha, myself, and I think there's a couple, Ralph Leonard, we're all of Nigerian heritage. I found that quite interesting. So I think there might be something in the kind of West African cultural attitudes that rejects certain types of narratives.
Yes, and it's a very good example of why you shouldn't just conflate American and British demographics, because actually an enormous proportion of Black British people are not descended from slaves, have migrated particularly from places like Nigeria. So it's just a completely different kind of sociological context. And lots of Black British professional people as well coming from places like Nigeria and being very aspirational in a way that makes sense, therefore, with being more resistant to some of the victimhood narratives, as you say.
It is interesting, and so much more research and work needs to be done on the kind of complexities of the Black British demographics, because as you mentioned, it is so fundamentally different to Americans, but also to the wider kind of British mainstream. So as you mentioned, 95% of African Americans are descendants from slaves in the kind of founding of America. And whereas that's completely different for Black British people, most came in the post-war years, and quite a significant proportion are people or children of people that came in the 1990s when Tony Blair hugely liberalised immigration laws. And whereas African Americans primarily are now a kind of singular ethnicity, the Black British population are incredibly diverse. The majority of Black British people, up until about kind of 15, 20 years ago, were Caribbean or Jamaican primarily, and now Nigerians and West Africans are the largest Black British minority. And it is quite interesting that you can kind of tell even in high school. So when I was in secondary school, there used to be an insult called "you were fresh off the boat," and that was kind of an insult within ethnic minority communities, saying that, oh well, you're not really as British as me because your parents came here more recently, and all the Black British kids, they wanted to be Caribbean. That was seen as cooler and more interesting. And now it's actually quite different. Now, when I hear a lot of the teenagers in school, they use a lot of West African slang. So even the kind of the cultural shift from the different ethnicities has completely shifted. And on top of that, the kind of medium age of Black British people, I think is something like mid-30s, whereas the median age for the white British population is some 20 years older. And so even that particular difference demonstrates that when we talk about, disparities, economic disparities, well, actually, a population that is on average much older and has built up wealth over several generations and even just decades of age is also going to influence the economic, if you just average out economically, what these different groups are going to have. So it just shows you just the kind of shoddy scholarship and the shoddy research that is forwarded to paint a particular narrative, when just some of those facts are just completely ignored or not talked about. Another fact that I found really fascinating when I was researching lots of these issues in 2020 was the proportion of Black British people who were born abroad. The proportion of white British people born abroad is very small, less than 10%. Whereas for ethnic minority people, it's something like 40%, if not more. Now, that's a huge difference in terms of cultural attitudes, cultural values, again, how long you've been in the society to kind of move up the social ladder. And we don't talk about any of this. We just say, what's the average income for both ethnicities? Well, it's more for white people. And therefore, there must be discrimination involved.
I want to get back to the sexual cultures thing, which I also want to talk about in the extended section. Because I think we disagree a little bit on the extent. Okay, so I think I would say, yes, there is advantage I'm not advocating full Saudi Arabia, but
But
I do also think that there needs to be but for that, Mrs. Lincoln, I think there need to be guardrails of some kinds. I think there need to be norms. I think that actually, in order to have a really sort of well-functioning sexual culture, I think there need to be sort of shared expectations which regulate behaviour. Because I think if it's a complete free-for-all and people just do completely whatever they want, you end up having lots of dysfunction and having lots of people getting hurt. And I wanted to talk about this in relation to, as you say, having a very young skewing ethnic minority population in Britain, often people coming from quite conservative cultures, being much more religious than white British people. And I was, while you were talking about that, I was thinking of Michaela Cole's series, I May Destroy You. Have you seen it? I think it's really, really good. And it was enormously well received when it came out a year or two ago on TV. And the thing that I felt really strongly watching it, and also knowing a little bit about Michaela Cole's background, because she used to be extremely religious and then is maybe less so now, but you can still see very clearly, I think, in the whole show, her kind of Christian assumptions about sexuality. And on the one hand, some people read it as being a sort of sex positive account of why consent is really important. Okay, so that's one way that you can read the show, because you have the characters sort of experiencing sexual abuse in various different ways, and it's a very sort of sensitive portrayal of how people can be harmed by sexual abuse and misbehaviour. But then I also watched it and I thought, hang on, every single time someone is sort of chooses to be hedonistic sexually, they end up being punished in one way or another in the show. Like, that's a really consistent theme. And actually the sex scenes are really not very sexy at all. I think they're deliberately filmed to not be very sexy. It's like filmed at a distance and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, I actually think what's going on here is Michaela Cole is actually herself very, very critical of the sexually liberal culture. And she's also a very clever writer and actress. And it's like embedded within the story is actually a very critical position on what is, really a very white progressive thing. Like, the sex positive culture is actually really at odds with, say, Michaela's family culture and what you'll not just West African communities, but also South Asian, and like completely different attitude. And I actually thought there's a really, really interesting tension there, which most reviewers of the show, I thought, missed. Do you see that tension playing out in how sort of sexual culture is emerging in Britain?
No, I think that's a really interesting perspective on the show. And I do think that for most ethnic minority people, they do feel that in their own kind of family life, in a whole host of things. I mean, sexual culture is one of them, but I mean, there's quite a famous or well-known meme that I've seen on Instagram and TikTok of when ethnic minority people, when they're younger, they go to their white parents' house, and the white friend's house, sorry, and their friend is like arguing with their parents, and they're like completely mortified that they could speak like that to their parents because that would just be completely alien.
There are very funny TikToks about it.
Yeah.
God, there's like a whole genre of this. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I think for most, obviously, again, I don't want to generalize that. I mean, I think it's probably best for me to speak about Nigerian people, even though I think there's a lot of parallels in different ethnic minority people from the global south. But the message oftentimes is very simple. It's don't have sex till you're married. It's pretty much as simple as that. And there is and it oftentimes is about bringing shame on the family. And I think I understand a lot of the critiques of cultures of shame, and I think that, of course, that they can be taken to the extreme. But I think there is something very important and meaningful when people aren't just thinking about how they personally feel about engaging in an act, but actually how their family and community will feel about that. Actually, I think it ties us to kind of relationships of obligation and meaning and duty beyond just our kind of individual self-interest. And so for most kind of Nigerian girls, it is as simple as kind of don't have sex until you're married. And on top of that, your parents are often wanting you to marry up. You know, they're very much thinking about the family that your prospective other comes from, and so there's lots of kind of different considerations within that. You know, in contrast to a culture which hasn't got any of those particular obligations and norms, if not the other direction, as you mentioned, where for a lot of young girls, you know, they'll be told that they're frigid or judged if they're not partaking in the kind of sexually promiscuous culture. And I think that can be very difficult to navigate for a lot of ethnic minority young women. But I think a lot of them, for example, which is quite a good kind of counterbalance, will find relationships with people in the church, you know, if they're Christian, and be able to opt out of that. But others, I think, will feel kind of torn between these two worlds. And so I don't disagree with you when you say that actually we should have certain norms and certain obligations, because I think, as you put in your book, that freedom for the pike is death for the minnow.
Freedom for the pike is death for the minnow.
Yeah. But
not my phrase, but a great phrase.
Yeah, I think, but I don't see that as kind of contradictory to still having a level of freedom of choice. So I don't see the kind of sex positive feminism as the kind of pinnacle of freedom, because I actually think there's something very unfree about a kind of pervasive culture which doesn't have any kind of boundaries. Because if you have no boundaries, then it's not really freedom. It's essentially just a very kind of shallow form of license. And to me, freedom and morality go hand in hand, because then you're kind of making a choice and weighing up the different moral values and moral ways of being within society, and then and making a choice to whether that's embrace that or go against that. So I is a difficult argument to make, but I don't think that the sex positive feminism is, even though it's said it's done in the name of progress, I think that you can think that is not a good thing and not an example of progress, while still actually being resistant to an absolute morality around sexual relations, if that makes sense. Is there a middle ground between those things?
Somewhere between Saudi Arabia and like Sin City, yeah. I don't know, maybe we have to try, don't we?
Oh, I would agree with all of your with many of your critiques about the harm it's causing to a lot of people, the kind of pornified culture, the way that dating happening on dating apps where everybody's got their own ideas, and the people that genuinely want a committed relationship are don't know where to go, because you're in a particular marketplace where you could be engaging with someone that's only interested in hookups, but has learned how to kind of game this system and abuse or exploit people. So I agree with all of those things. I guess the difficulty is, so for me, I think agency has to come into it, and also what would this counter or new morality that and new norms be rooted in? Is it just a purely kind of utilitarian argument about this is kind of harming people, so let's try something different? And I know that you're obviously very interested in evolutionary psychology, but to me, I think what was good about the past sexual morality is that it was rooted in a notion of the good that in itself was rooted in a kind of religious ethic. And I think in order for something to, I think it has to be rooted in something stronger for it to really gain cultural and moral authority within society. And I'm just not sure that we're at that point yet where it feels rooted, other than just a kind of general critique of the direction of travel.
I want to talk about this more in the extended bit, because there's a lot more to say, I think, about the tension between, conservative religious cultures and the mainstream, which is the other end of the spectrum, which is really interesting. I'm going to wrap up, though, the free bit of the episode. Inaya, can you please let people know where they can find more of your work? The Equiano Project, where they can see you on telly, all of that.
Yeah, so the equianoproject.com, lots of really interesting videos and articles and reviews about from ethnic minority people and other people, all people that are kind of critical and challenging in a very courageous and interesting way. I don't tweet too much anymore. So, I mean, I would tell people to go to my Twitter, but I've kind of, I can't do it.
Very sensible. Yeah. I don't tweet that much either.
So I would just say my website, inayafolarin.com, where I put all my articles and videos from wherever I'm broadcasting. And there's all of my ideas on lots of these issues there.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for watching that episode of Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, and for all of your support. It means an enormous amount for the growth of the show. If you want to hear bonus content, an extra 20-30 minutes of conversation with the guest, maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit less filtered, then you can go to my Substack at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can sign up for extended episodes and also bonus episodes, and you can also access our chat community. You can also support the show by subscribing on YouTube or subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts is also really great for encouraging other people to give the show a try. Please also spread the word, tell people that you know who you think might like it to give it a shot. The word of mouth effect is really valuable, so we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, watching, and supporting what we're doing.